I wonder what your favorite subject is at school, or maybe if school was a bit further along ago than for you. I wonder what your favorite subject at school was. Maybe if you're doing homeschool right now, your that favorite subject is maybe a little bit different for mum and dad, or whoever's looking after you. Maybe their favorite subject is anything. If it's not at home, we're just desperate to get back to life as normal, right? But my favorite subject was PE, and I loved all of that. Any sport will do. Never wanted to miss a session of that, but I also loved history. I loved hearing stories about people and countries over time. I just loved that. And we're going to do a little bit of that this morning as we head into Daniel chapter 8. And as we move from 7 to 8 in Daniel, Daniel's going to make two shifts. And the first shift is a shift of time. Last week in chapter 7, Daniel had this vision that was like across the broad sweep of human history, right the way from the first kingdom that came after the fall of Jerusalem, right the way through past today to when Jesus Christ returns again. It's like the sort of photo at a wedding where the photographer steps back and says, right, everyone, we're going to squeeze everyone in one shot. Marjorie, move in. Jeff, pay attention. Everyone smile, cheese. You know, but if you had that photo, you could zoom in on one or two people in particular. In chapter 8 is where Daniel does that. He takes all of these things, and in the second vision, he zooms in on two kingdoms in particular, the Medes and the Persians, and then the Greeks. And then it's like he zooms in again on one leader that will come out of Greece, one particular leader that he wants to focus on. And that's where our attention is going today. But Daniel also makes a second shift, and the second shift is in terms of language. Chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic. It was a language that just about everyone understood, and it was like God was saying, I want the whole of the world to be able to pay attention to what I'm communicating here. Whereas when you get to chapter 8, the language changes back to Hebrew. It's the language of God's people, the Jews. And it's like God turns away from talking to the crowds to say, my precious people, I've got a message specifically for you. And so let's have a look at that. Daniel chapter 8 breaks down into two parts. The first part is Daniel's vision. It's potentially a dream because at one point he says he was deep asleep. And the second part is where the angel Gabriel brings the interpretation. Daniel sees a ram, and Gabriel tells him that ram represents the Medes and the Persians. And then Daniel sees a goat, and it moves super quick. It hardly touches the ground. It destroys the ram, and it has this big single horn that Gabriel tells Daniel, this represents the king of Greece. And fascinatingly, from history outside the Bible, we understand that this is really like Alexander the Great, who, when he took over Greece, he just went on the rampage and he spread super quickly, conquering lots of places all at once. But then Daniel sees something really strange with this horn on this goat. It gets broken off and replaced by 4 other horns. And we know also from history that despite all the success of Alexander the Great, he actually died really early on at the age of 32, probably of malaria, maybe a little bit of alcoholism there. And there was no natural successor to his kingdom. And so 4 generals are raised up, and the kingdom is divided between them. And as Daniel sees these 4 horns that represent those 4 leaders, one horn becomes really prominent and grows up. And that's what Daniel is focusing on, that one leader in particular. And so now we're like fully zoomed in our photo. And as we turn to Daniel chapter 8, we're going to read the vision part and then the interpretation part just of that leader. Okay, so here we are, fully zoomed in. If you've got a Bible, you can open up. We're going to go to Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. If you have a phone, you can scroll. That seems appropriate when you're thinking Bible, scrolling through Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. Should we read? Out of one of them, that's one of the 4 horns, came another horn which started small but grew up in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land, that's Israel. And it grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry host to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled?" The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Now we're going to go down to verse 23, which is the interpretation of that part. In the latter part of their reign, when the rebels had become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, that's this leader in particular, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, and not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Now, this might seem a bit confusing, but what it's communicating, but here's what it's communicating to God's people. When they return from exile to their land, there's going to be a period of time in future, a short, sharp period of acute persecution that's going to be really painful for them, and it's going to come through this leader in particular. So that's why Daniel says things like he's going to trample down the starry host. This is like he's going to persecute the Jewish people, and he's going to set himself up against the commander of the army of the Lord, and it's referred later to as the Prince of Princes. It's like this leader is going to set himself up as like equal with God, thinks he's greater than Israel's God. He's going to take away the daily sacrifice, which means he's going to remove their ability to practice their religion and stop the temple worship. It also says that truth was thrown to the ground, that this guy was going to repress the teaching of God's word. And we know that this leader was a man named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he did these things that Daniel sees in the vision. And even worse, he set up this statue in the temple area, a statue to the Greek god Zeus, and he sacrificed pigs on that altar, something that was so offensive to the Jewish people, and he killed many of them. But God also says that there will be a moment where this acute period comes to an end, and it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and we don't know exactly whether that means 2,300 like mornings and evenings as in days, or whether we mean 2,300 mornings and evenings, which means it's like half that number, just like 1,100 days. Either way, the end of that period, scholars are absolutely united on what it represents. It represents the moment where a guy called Judas Maccabeus reconsecrated the temple in 164 BC, and it's a moment that Jews celebrate every year, even today, with the festival in December called Hanukkah. Now, the fascinating thing about this prophecy is that it was fulfilled completely in history. Now, it could be that this Antiochus character is sort of a foreshadowing of the Antichrist that we read about in like 2 Thessalonians 2 and Revelation 13. But it would just be like a foreshadowing. We need nothing more to happen in the future for this prophecy. It's already been fulfilled in history. And actually the Antichrist character is referred to much more clearly in Daniel chapter 7 that Matt went through last week. And in a couple of weeks when Jerome goes through Daniel chapters 10 to 12. And so what we're left with this week is this acute period of persecution for God's people that God tells them about, that God knew about, that God allowed to happen, and God delivered them at a time that he chose. And it can leave you scratching your heads like, why are we looking at this? Like, why, what relevance does this have for us today? But I think there's a lot we can take out of this, because it teaches us about the relationship between God and his people when they go through periods of suffering. See, for many of us, following Jesus today is just not easy. You know, maybe you're at school and some of your school friends have heard that you're somebody who sort of goes to church, and the thought of like inviting them to the massive or the squad just seems like really hard for you because you get laughed at school. People treat you differently because they've heard that you're somebody who believes in Jesus. Maybe you've come to believe in Jesus and you've sort of lost relationship with friends or family because of what you now believe. Maybe you're at uni and there's a lecturer that just is determined to get you to see that there's no basis for your faith. Maybe it's different for you. Maybe for you, work is really problematic. And every day you're concerned that you might get forced into a situation where believing in Jesus might cause you to have to put your job on the line. And every day you're wondering, will this be my last in work? Maybe that's not the sort of area you're in right now, but actually there's a period of real acute persecution or difficulty that you're going through. It could be a health challenge, it could be a relationship challenge, a finance challenge, all sorts of things, and it's just making you feel desperate. It's like this acute period of pain. And I want to say, when we go through these moments, what do we learn from Daniel? What do the people of God need to know about God in order to journey through these periods of suffering? There's three things I want you to take away this morning. The first is this: God knows. God knows. When I was younger, a few years ago, some friends of mine and me, we went up a mountain in the UK and we were super proud, super bold, and we just boosted up really fast, and we passed these slow coaches along the way that are going up with a guide, and we go up and it starts to get dark and it starts to get cold and it starts to get wet, and my map was a bit soggy and I couldn't really read it properly and never been up this mountain before, and then my head torch starts to go dark, and so I can't really certainly can't read the map anymore. We get a little bit lost and we make the decision, do you know what, we're just going to have to turn around and go back down. And do you know the worst thing about going back down was we had to walk past the slow coaches, walking up merrily behind their guide. And do you know what I bet about some of those people? They'd probably never been up the mountain before. They probably had no idea where they were going. It was just as cold and dark and wet and difficult for them, but they were okay. Why? Because even though they didn't know where they were going, what was going on, it was enough for them that they were with somebody who did know. And for the Jews in that situation, it was exactly the same. God communicated to them ahead of time. Daniel sees this vision 550 BC. It doesn't get fulfilled. Antiochus doesn't come on the scene until about 175 BC, 375 years later. But God could already tell them all that time before exactly what they were going through. God knows that the God they had knew the end from the beginning, and he's the same God that we have today. He knows the end from the beginning. You may not have seen this season coming, but God did. God knew, God knows, and he's able to lead you through. A few years ago, my pastor in the UK had a word for me, and it was just a picture of a tree stump and tree rings, and he said, some of the thin rings are the difficult years for the tree, but it's where the tree gets its strength from. And it didn't really mean anything for me at the time, but about a year later I reflected on that word and it suddenly came to mind. I think it was God that brought it to mind for me. And as I reflected on the year that had just gone by, it was the hardest year that Jenny and I had ever been through. We'd had 2 miscarriages, and a really good friend of ours at church, a guy not much older than me, a father of 3 kids, had tragically died in an accident. It was such a hard year for us. But as I reflected on that word, I realized God knew that I was about to go through a hard year, and it didn't change anything. But can I say about what happened? But can I say something went on inside me as I realized, wow, God, you knew. You knew this wasn't going to take me out. You knew that you were able to lead me through. Wow. And I just wonder if our souls might be strengthened today in the knowledge that we might not know what's going on. We might not see things coming, but God knew. Second thing I want you to see, God knows and God is powerful. Notice that the timing of Antiochus coming is completely under God's control. God can number those days ahead of time, showing that he is completely in control. Sure, there's this leader that's going to come along that is way more powerful than the Jews, but God is way more powerful still. When you come through to the interpretation that we read, this theme of power comes through. Verse 24, he will become very strong, but not by his own power. Verse 25, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. It gives us this sense that actually this is not just about Antiochus. There is a power that is at work behind him. There's something bigger going on. It leads us to think beyond just the human opposition to God's people, to the spiritual opposition to God's people. God's arch enemy, Satan, who loves to oppose God and loves to oppose God's people. But even though it seems to be that was the power at work, God is even more powerful still. It reminds me of Ephesians 1, where it talks about the power of God that is at work within us, that God exerted in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule, authority, power, and dominion. It doesn't matter what power is facing you. It doesn't matter who it is or what it is. The God that we serve is greater still. And I wonder what it is that you can do to remind yourself of his power, because I think some of us have just put God in a box and we've decided that what we expect of God will be what we can imagine doing ourselves, and God needs to just come out of that box today. He was never in your box anyway, let's be honest. And can we take moments where we stand in awe of him and we remind ourselves of his power? One of the ways you can do that, I think, is through prayer. The Psalms are full of laments where David is in awful situations and he comes and he cries out to God. He says, God, this situation is awful. And yet in that prayer, he comes to these moments where he says, but this I know of you. And therefore I can trust you, and my confidence is in you. I can lean on you. See, David is coming to a place where he realizes God is powerful. I think worship is also important to remind us of the power of God. A few years ago, Jenny and I got burgled. We came back from a weekend away and our house had just been completely upside down. Do you know the first thing we did? We ordered curry. That is actually true. But then we put worship music on. And we decided that we were going to change the atmosphere in our home, and where we could get despondent, where we could look down, we were going to look up. We were going to fix our eyes on him. And as we filled our home with the worship and the praise of the wonder and the glory of God, something changed in us. Do you know what? We didn't ever feel bad about being in that home. There was nothing negative about it that you might expect if you got burgled, because I think we just changed the atmosphere and we fixed our eyes on God. And I wonder if some of you need to change the atmosphere in your home this week. Maybe just there's negativity. Maybe you've just got despondent. Will you fill that place with worship? Would you fill that place with the magnification and the glorification of God? Would you fix your eyes and your heart and your soul on him? You see, God knows, and God is powerful, and God is at work. The fact that God is powerful means that he also must have purpose. If God is allowing something to happen, it's because he is at work. And the text tells us that this persecution happened because of a rebellion. And it seems like the Jews may have given themselves to the worship of Greek idols in some way. And so God was using Antiochus as an instrument of his divine judgment. Now, switch on, pay attention. If the person next to you has fallen asleep, nudge them, wake them up, because I don't want them to miss this. I am not saying that if you are going through a time of acute pain or persecution, it's because God is punishing you. That is not what I am saying. Is that clear enough? That the punishment for sin, if you've believed in Jesus, has already been laid on him. Every sin, past, present, and future, has been completely done for once and for all. You have already passed through judgment because you have believed in Jesus. But having believed, God is at work in your life, and he's going to use all sorts of situations and circumstances. He's not the architect of those situations. He's not saying those situations are good, but he is working good through them. See, we can be confident that God is making us more like Jesus. He's going to use all sorts of situations and circumstances to accomplish that work. It's what James means when he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because what God is doing through that is developing perseverance that leads us to maturity. It reminds me of a favorite hymn of mine that's called How Firm a Foundation. One of the verses is this sort of as if God is talking to us. It says, when through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flames shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume, and thy gold to refine. God uses really difficult circumstances in our lives to purify us and make us more like Jesus. And can we consider one another when we're persecuted or when we're in these really acute moments of pain, that maybe, just maybe, we are blessed. Maybe, just maybe, the more difficult the season, the deeper the work and the more wonderful the work he's doing in you. Maybe, just maybe, you're going to discover things about Jesus, and there's going to be an intimacy and a preciousness about your relationship in this season that could never happen were things as you would choose them to be. I believe we're blessed today in these moments, not because the situation is good, but because God is doing something deep and wonderful. And may God finish that work. May God finish that work in us. But secondly, if God in his grace has determined that today is not the day that Jesus is going to return, if he is delaying that, it is because even though if you believe in Jesus, we long for Jesus to return. We long for Jesus to return. For my friends and family members and the people in my community that I know that do not believe in Jesus, the return of Jesus will be a desperate day and a terrible day. And if Jesus has not returned today, it's because God in his grace is keeping the door of salvation open. And yes, that means his people have to go through these times of persecution because we live in this world marred by sin. We're not immune from it, but because God, there's a greater purpose and God is at work and he's keeping the door of salvation open just a little bit longer. And so can we use these moments of trial and persecution as a trigger to remind us, yes, I'm going to pray about this situation. Yes, I'm going to ask God to bring me through it, but I'm also going to use it to remind me to reach out and to think about those in my life, that no matter how bad it gets for me right now, if people don't believe in Jesus, their eternity separate from God will be far worse. And so can we use those moments to call out to God and say, these people in my life that do not yet believe in Jesus, God, pour out your grace. God, pour out your mercy. God, let them experience your love. God, shine the light of the gospel into their heart that they might believe. Can there be this determination in us that we're going to lean into the work of God that's making us more like Jesus, and we're going to lean into the work of evangelism where we would be desperate to see the people around us believe in Jesus. As we draw all of these things to a close, I want to remind you of some words in 2 Corinthians that I think pull this together so beautifully. 2 Corinthians 4 says this: therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we're wasting away, that's how some of you feel today, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles, remember for Paul, that was like he went through awful stuff. But even he, and therefore I think we can say, for our light and momentary troubles, are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Can we remember today, church? Okay, can we remember God knows? God is powerful and God is at work, making you more like Jesus and keeping the door open as long as possible so that as many as possible believe. And can we use these moments that are about to enter in right now of worship to fix our eyes again and say, Lord Jesus, we want to fix our eyes on you. We're going to worship you and we're going to trust you in this season. Church, I love you. Let's turn our attention to Jesus right now and worship.